Today we are going to learn about fetal circulation. Before going into that, we should know how an adult circulation is, what are the unique features of the fetal circulation, and how the blood circulates in the fetus and how it gets saturated. In the subsequent video, we will learn what changes take place at birth and what are the remnants that will remain in the body when the fetal circulation transforms into the adult circulation. So, coming to adult circulation, blood from different parts of the body reaches the right atrium of the heart. So, blood from the lower part of the body reaches through inferior vena cava and from upper parts of the body through the superior vena cava. Both these cavae open into the right atrium. When the right atrium contracts, the blood flows through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. At that time, the right ventricle will be in a relaxed or the receptive state. From there, the blood is pumped when the ventricles contract into the pulmonary arteries to reach the lungs. In the lungs, the blood gets saturated and is returned to the heart via the pulmonary veins. They open into the left atrium. From the left atrium, through the mitral valve, it reaches the left ventricle. Again, when the ventricles contract, the blood is pumped through the aorta into different parts of the body. So, it is a series circuit that is functioning in an adult. Coming to the fetal circulation, in the fetus, there are many differences from the adult circulation. The blood is saturated from the maternal circulation, that is from the placenta. And there are many shunts, that is there are intracardiac and extracardiac shunts between saturated and unsaturated blood. Then the systemic vascular resistance is low, whereas pulmonary vascular resistance is high in fetuses, which is unlike that of adult where the systemic vascular resistance is high. So what happens in a fetus? Blood from the placenta enters the fetus through the umbilical vein to the liver. Majority of the blood bypasses the liver to enter the inferior vena cava through a structure called ductus venosus. Ductus venosus is a trumpet-like structure which connects the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava just below the diaphragm. For those of you who wants to go into detail, majority of the blood in the liver comes from the umbilical vein, then from the portal vein and the hepatic artery. The blood from the umbilical vein flows both into the right and the left lobes of liver, whereas that of the portal vein flows mainly to the right lobe of the liver. So, the left lobe of the liver contains 95% umbilical venous blood, whereas the right lobe of the liver contains blood from umbilical vein, that is 40 to 50%, and 30 to 40% from the portal vein, and 10% from the hepatic artery. The blood that enters the inferior vena cava contains blood both from the lower parts of the body and that from the umbilical vein. The blood in the umbilical vein is more saturated and it has got a higher kinetic energy. So, it occupies, as you can see in the figure, it occupies the dorsal wall of the inferior vena cava. So, the streams are kept a little separate and it reaches the right atrium. The blood from the upper half of the body is brought by the superior vena cava to the right atrium. Now, look closely at the apertures of the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. The inferior vena caval stream is so directed that it flows through a structure called foramen ovale into the left atrium, whereas some of the blood from the inferior vena cava and the blood from the superior vena cava goes via the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. There is a structure called foramen ovale, as I have said. This is a partition. This is a hole between the right atrium and the left atrium. So this is the inside of the heart. So this is the inferior vena caval opening. There is a structure called crista dividens, which is the upper part of the interventricular septum. This also divides the inferior vena cava blood in such a way that is the dorsal flow goes into the left atrium. And there is another thing, that the foramen ovale is so directed that only the inferior vena cava blood will move into the right atrium. It is so made that the saturated blood passes from the right atrium into the left atrium. Now, we have seen that the blood from superior vena cava and part of the inferior vena cava blood, that is unsaturated portion, that is from the lower parts of the body, has entered the right ventricle. Now, the blood from the right ventricle is supposed to flow through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. But in the fetuses, it doesn't flow much to the lungs because the lungs are in a contracted state. The alveoli are not expanded. So also are the pulmonary vessels, which are maintaining a high tone. This is because the vasoconstrictors act over the vasodilators and it is remaining in the constricted state. Only 10 to 12% of the blood enters the lungs, which reaches up to 30% at term. What happens to the other blood? It passes through a structure called ductus arteriosus. Ductus arteriosus is a connection from after the origin of the left pulmonary artery to the descending aorta. So this blood passes to the descending aorta. The blood from the left atrium, when the left atrium contracts, reaches the left ventricle and is passed on to the aorta as in an adult circulation. So we have seen that it is a more saturated blood that is entered the left atrium. So that is the blood that enters the left ventricle and it passes through the aorta. So before it is being joined by the ductus arteriosus, arises the arteries that goes to supply the upper parts of the body, which includes the brain. So this part gets more saturated blood, whereas when after being joined by the ductus arteriosus, the descending aorta has blood both saturated and unsaturated, and it goes down to pass through the umbilical artery back to the placenta. It also supplies the lower parts of the body. As the color scheme here indicates, so this is from the lower part of the body. This is pure saturated blood coming from the mother. It is getting mixed up here with the blood from the upper part of the body and from the inferior vena cava ventral portion. And here it is less saturated. And once it from here, the blood moves on to the left side where it contains more of oxygen. And after getting joined from the ductus venosus, it gets more unsaturated, and that indicated by the purple color.